Ladies and gentlemen, can we request you a big round of applause for our guests?
Thanks, Ankit. Hey, Peter.
Hey, how are things in India?
Very good. Good morning.
Good evening to you.
So Peter is, just to introduce to those people here in the audience, Peter has the distinction of now being on our conclave for the third time in a row, straight row. I mean, we usually we call our international speakers, and we have a lot of people to present to India, and therefore we sometimes take a break here and there. But Peter, we just could not take a break because something special about Peter is that this man, whatever he said in the first interaction came true. So we called him for the second one, and then he spoke on the second interaction, and all that came true. So, you know, the entire estimates that he made for the world economy, the way things were going, etc. Other than, of course, this Putin situation, Ukraine situation, he was bang on target on all his predictions, projections, whatever you want to call it. And that's why we thought, we had to get him this time and present him and listen to what he has to say over this extremely crucial and extremely interesting cliffhanger that we are currently sitting on. Unfortunately, it's real. It's not a movie situation that we are in. We're practically on the brink of a very, very, very dangerous situation in terms of the war that is, currently on in Europe. And then, it's got at the background layer of it is the pandemic, post-pandemic, inflation that is setting in almost all the major economies. There is general pandemonium in various countries, in terms of inflation. In fact, in the neighborhood, we have seen two neighboring countries, almost collapsing. And in all this situation, we thought, who better than Mr. Peter Zeihan to tell us as to what is in store for us over the next 3 to 6 months, maybe a year or two, and even beyond, and how he sees the world evolving. So, Peter, we hear about the Russian leader, Vladimir Putin. He's almost a legend, a KGB officer in charge of the Berlin bureau, last to walk out of the office after burning the papers with this burning desire in his mind, in his head for revenge. I mean, of course, this could be a story that is created and part of the propaganda, but that's the general story that we all carry, that this man is doing all this because he has a personal, almost zealous mission of bringing back the glory days of the Soviet Empire. So, this should mean that the move on Ukraine and before that Belarus is a personal project. I want to ask you, are the people of Russia with Vladimir Putin, because if it's a personal project and they are under so much of trouble because of the sanctions, are they really supporting him? What do you think?
You've got to look at why this war is actually happening and why it's happening now. So I think the best way to approach it for an Indian audience is to think about it from your point of view. Where does India concentrate most of its armed forces? In Punjab, because you have a land bridge between populated India and populated Pakistan, and that is a security threat. Well, Russia has 9 Punjabs. And unfortunately for the region, the people who live in Russia's Punjabs are not Russian. So the only way that Russia feels it can be secure is to expand out until it reaches these bridges, these gateways to its core territories, and then hunkers down its forces in the gap just like you do every single day. It's just that they have to do it at 9 places, and that means occupying a number of countries with a combined population that is greater than Russia's. So Russia can never be like the United States. It can never be like India. It has to be more like Germany, where it has to have a forward-positioned military stationing policy simply in order to give it what it feels is the minimum necessary security for it to exist. And in that sort of environment, it is very aggressive because from the Russian point of view, this has to be done and it has to be done now. The Russian demography is collapsing. And this is the last time that the Russians are going to have a sufficient number of young people to attempt this sort of effort. So two things from this. Number one, there will be no peace talks that matter because the Russians aren't interested. And second, Ukraine is not the end of the story. The Russians are going to push past Ukraine into a number of other countries to their west, which is going to generate a conflict with NATO at some point. And we can talk about what that's going to look like. We can talk about what the NATO countries are doing to try to stop it. But this is what at stake here. We're talking about the Russians needing to get under their thumb at least another 140 million people. The first 50 million just happen to be Ukrainian.
Wow. So in that case, you mean that there cannot be an outcome short of annexation, because right now they're talking about May 9th being a victory day. They want to just get some parts of, southeast Ukraine for a land bridge between, Russia and Crimea, and then they walk back. So what you say is that they're not going to stop, and this is not a personal project of a zealous man seeking revenge. It's the whole population, and the Russian people actually need it. I mean, they have to do it. That's what you mean?
It can still be a personal project. It can be both. And in the case of the Russians, remember, their demographics started collapsing 30 years ago. So the youngest, and their educational system collapsed at the same time. So the youngest group of people who actually have a skill set are now in their late 50s. Putin's pushing 70. And the only people at the end of the Soviet era who really understood what was going on were the FSB, the KGB agents, because they had been in charge of the late system for Gorbachev, Chernigov, and Andropov. Putin is an extension of that line. Well, if you combine the demographic problem with the information vacuum, there's only like 150 people left in Russia who are in their political elite. This is their last window from any number of measures. And so no, May 9th, it's going to be a nice little party they're going to have. They're going to celebrate, but they're not going to stop the war. They're going to keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And we are now in an artillery conflict. And that is something where Russian equipment and training actually does very well. From a human point of view, it's horrific. But in terms of military capacity, we're in a stage of the war now that is actually playing to the Russian strengths.
Okay, so I just want to sort of sidestep a little bit from the war. I'll come back to it to ask you one question, which I thought is important here. Many countries in the world which face this demographic challenge of depleting populations have, looked at a relaxed immigration policy as a measure. We have never heard of that from the Russian side at all. It's not that they don't have the land, they have the technology. It's not that they can't sort of get people across the globe to start learning Russian probably and sort of move there. There would be enough people from Asia who would be quite interested to move in. I mean, what do you think about that? Wouldn't that be a much easier way to do it?
The Russians are, to be perfectly blunt, pretty racist. And the Russians have had an immigration policy. They have two, actually. So in the first one, they just started attracting all of the ethnic Russians from the parts of the Soviet Union that were now independent countries, whether that's Ukraine or Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan. That brought them about 20 million people over the course of the last 30 years, and that's pretty much tapped out. There are very few Russians left anywhere in the world that are not in, say, the European Union now and really don't want to move back to Russia, where their standard of living would be a third of what it is now. The second one is they have an informal program that attracts migrants to do certain jobs, especially construction and agriculture, that mostly taps the Central Asian states, most notably Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Kazakhstan. That has been more successful, but these people are never going to be Russian citizens. They're there as migrant labor. And anyone beyond kind of that ring of the old Soviet influence, moving to Russia's a tough call. I mean, low standard of living, very difficult climate, crumbling infrastructure, minimal social services. It's not the sort of place that you move because you want to move up in the world. It's the sort of place you move because there just isn't anything better on offer. And I'd say that even with some of my more dire predictions for East Asia, there's not a lot of people who want to take them up on that offer.
Okay, so now coming back to the current situation and impact on oil, before I get into talking about what will happen to oil now in 2022, I happened to read something which we have not discussed in our prior call, but I thought this would be interesting for people to know here,
sure,
that the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989, which probably a lot of people in today's day and age look at it as a historic event, but people who lived through it actually thought about it as a breakdown of it was a clash of two different economic models, the capitalist model on one side and the communist model on one side, and eventually the communist model failed. And that's the general legend all of us have sort of grown up on. Many of us do not know this lesser known fact, which Peter has actually written in one of his papers, which I happened to read while preparing for this, that actually 1988 was the Russian peak oil, and there was something that happened during that time in which certain terms and conditions between Russia and its other Soviet states, the different countries which formed, different states which formed the Soviet Union, changed, and which led to a whole turmoil. Can you please expand on that, Peter? Because that's something that's very, very interesting. That actually oil was the reason and not the communist model. I mean, of course, that was inefficient, but oil really was the reason.
Well, at the late Soviet period, particularly once we got to 1989, the Soviet industrial base collapsed. It was never very efficient, and as soon as there was any access to the rest of the world, people went with goods that were cheaper and higher quality. So the entire Soviet industrial base collapsed in on itself, even before the Soviet Union ended. Well, the Russians at that point were producing roughly 11 million barrels a day of crude. And when internal demand dropped, and there wasn't sufficient external demand in order to make up the difference, pressure started building up back through the pipes all the way to the wellhead. And when it reached the wellhead, the Russians had a very simple choice to make. Do we keep running it and it risk the entire pipe system busting and having leaks through the entire 4,000 kilometer length of the pipes? Or do we shut it in? So they shut it in. But Russia's oil production is in the permafrost. So the pipes go down through that frozen layer. As long as the liquid is moving, that's not a problem. But once it stops, it starts to do what liquids do under pressure and expand a little bit, and it busts the rivets and it busts the pipes. So all of the wells that were shut down in the late 80s, early 90s were shut down forever. We're starting to see that now. We're starting to see a situation where the pipes are backing up, refineries are going offline because they don't have anywhere to sell the crude to. No one's picking up their crude at places like Novorossiysk on the Black Sea. And very soon, certainly within 2 months, the Russians are going to have to shut in production. And that production will be gone for decades, because the last time this happened in 1988 to 1992, they didn't get it back up online until this last December. So one way or another, the world is going to have to get used to 4 to 5 million barrels per day of less Russian crude later this year.
No, that's quite something, because that would practically mean that Russia, which does not have anything other than oil, it's like practically decapitating the earning member of the family. And is that not enough reason for a preemptive and proactive military action than currently we look at the Russian military action in Ukraine and the response and NATO support, etc., as a contained war, and only that something that could go wrong in that situation would be if NATO really got into it by chance. Either somebody bombs a NATO position, or NATO actually is sort of seen by Russia inside. But here we are looking at a situation where, if you're saying it's just 2 months and once it starts breaking down, they took 32 years and to come back. Obviously, even with current technology, it will take at least 10 or 15 years, and that means that by the time alternative fuels would have come, and that's the end of Russian oil, and there's no earning member. You're just going to kill him. So why would Russia not actually straight away get into an action in the next 2 months than just pushing around in Ukraine? And probably sort of, this is way more than putting a nuclear bomb anywhere on Russia. I mean, actually, if you hit with a limited strike on Moscow, would be less damaging than the infrastructure of their earning, the gas and oil infrastructure going down. Don't you think?
I mean, the Russian income is absolutely going to tank, but I would argue that we were already there. One of the features of the new sanctions programs is that the Russians have a hard time spending whatever hard currency they earn. They can't do it through normal means. They have to get physical cash and transfer it. And doing that for imports that come in the numbers of, billions of dollars a month, that's difficult. So the Russians are already facing that cash crunch, even with oil still coming out. I'm far more concerned about the broader international implications for us having the largest oil interruption ever. But remember, the Russians see this as an existential crisis. This war had to happen, and NATO had to resist it. So I don't want to say anything like it's going according to plan, because that's not what I'm after here. But this is something that has been inevitable for a long time. And now it's imminent, and now we're here. And for the Russians, it's not about money. And if there's one thing that binds all the Russian citizens together, it's a celebration of privation. This is not a country that is in the Indian or the British or the American tradition where economics trumps politics. Other way around, security is always paramount.
Wow. So, just to sum up whatever we discussed just now, we are looking at these sanctions and the current actions that have been taken have already pushed Russia and the Russian situation into probably destruction of that oil source and therefore income source. So what Russia does after that in Europe with reference to military actions, even more than what they are doing, is a current problem. But besides that, you're going to be taking out Russian oil from the current global supply forever, which would be about 4 to 5 million barrels a day, and that would be how much?
That would be the immediate impact. The Russians, they've expanded a lot of output to new fields since 1990. Most of that work was done by either BP or the Western oil services firms. They're all gone now. So you should expect the remaining Russian output to steadily decline over the course of the next couple of years anyway. So, for example, the Sakhalin projects that the Chinese are really interested in, they're the most advanced projects in the world that produce oil and natural gas for a pipe and natural gas for LNG. They're all going to get shut down this year, not because of backed up pipes, but because the people who know how to operate them are leaving. So 4 to 5 million barrels a day going west to Europe goes offline in a couple months. Another 2 or 3 million barrels a day from eastern Siberia, most of which goes to China, goes off this year or next year.
And there is, of course, oil in Iran and Venezuela, and they are also under sanctions. But let us expect that the U.S. probably would sort of be a little more flexible there, and that oil could come into the market. And of course, U.S. also has oil. So what do you think? Won't all that come in and fill in for the gap for that deficit?
Well, let's go through the candidates. Canada needs a new pipeline, minimum 2 years, if it's going to meaningfully increase output. Oil sands are not like drilling a normal well. You actually have to mine it. That's a lot of infrastructure. So Canada, really, you're talking a 3 to 5 year solution to get another 1 million barrels a day out of Canada. Venezuela, after 20 years of, in many cases, deliberate mismanagement, most of the reservoirs have suffered permanent damage. If you were to stabilize Venezuela where it is right now, that's a $10 billion project that'll take at least a year. You might be able to get 300,000 barrels out if you really push it this year, but you're talking about another $10 billion of investment into a country that is sketchy at best at the moment. Iran's a little bit brighter. If the sanctions were to disappear tomorrow, Iran would probably be able to bring another 400,000 to 500,000 barrels online within 12 months. But you also need to bring in a huge amount of an investment in a country that tends to confiscate investments. The Iranians like to say that the only reason people don't deal with Iran is the sanctions, but that's not true. Iran has the world's second or third most that's what I'm looking for, constrictive investment regimes. And so even when everything is open, even when you get a country like Italy or France who really doesn't care about the politics, it's still a very long, hard slog. So you're not going to get 1 million barrels out of Iran in any less than 2 years. That's everybody. I mean, OPEC has minimal spare capacity. Now, in the United States, pros and cons. First, the pro. We were in the midst of an oil build-out even before this happened. So we were probably going to be seeing another 1 million barrels a day within the calendar year. That will probably increase by about half now. And considering the environment we're in, that's great. However, it's nowhere near enough So if everyone who can be brought in is brought in, we're still talking about a shortage in excess of 3 million barrels a day this year, and then next year probably going up to 5. It's very difficult for me to see a scenario where that's going on, where oil prices stay below 170. And considering that the Biden administration is not incredibly popular, and it's a midterm election year in the United States, I think it's very highly likely that the United States is going to ban oil exports, or at least restrict them, in order to sever the American energy price environment from the global one. Now, that'll keep prices relatively low and mild in the United States, but that's going to remove another 3 million barrels a day of consumption capacity, production capacity from the rest of the world. So the rest of the world is going to have to get by without American and Russian oil at the same time, and that's going to rewire everything.
Okay, one question about India. In the worst of the emerging scenarios in crude supplies, what are your views about Europe, China, and India's energy strategies? What are India's strengths and weaknesses, and how do you think we should cope and prepare?
Okay, I think you're going to like this one. Okay, so if the Americans are going to remove themselves from the global energy market, the Europeans are the ones that in the short term are facing the biggest problem, because all that Russian crude that was going west is crude that they used to use. So the Europeans are going to have a very simple choice. I mean, they can petition the United States for a little bit of help, and the U.S. will send refined product to try to take the edge off of it, but it won't be nearly enough. The Europeans are going to need an alternate energy source, so they will go south. They will start interfacing with their former colonies throughout the African continent and making sure that those flows go north to Europe instead of east to Asia. The next country in the kick line is India. If there's minimal Russian crude and minimal African crude and minimal North American crude, all of a sudden India is looking at a global shortage that is greater than total Indian production. But India is the closest major country to the Persian Gulf. And any tankers that leave the Persian Gulf have to sail by India to get to East Asia. In that environment, India is the only country in the world with the military, economic, and political capacity to interface with the Persian Gulf from a point of strength. So I think it's going to be very easy and very necessary for India to go to Kuwait and the Emiratis and the Saudis and arrange a direct transfer deal. So prices will probably be uncomfortably high. That's going to be unavoidable, but you're not going to have a problem with actual supply. Okay. That's going to be for countries further east. Because if you remove all this oil from the market, then the entirety of the shortage falls to the last country in line, and that's China. We may be in China's last year as a manufacturing power already. Because if they can't keep the lights on, nothing else matters.
So that's quite a dire situation that you're talking of from the point of view of China. One last question, just to wrap up, and this is something that, let's hope he has positive things to say, and whatever he says negative doesn't come true, but that's not been the record this man has had. So you're talking about a damaged Russian crude infrastructure, disruption in Ukraine and Russia, wheat and agriculture supplies, dysfunctional Kazakh sources also, you said it goes through Russia, oil at abnormally high levels, and this plus post-QE inflation hitting hard, China shutting down cities now for the COVID waves. This is the present to the next few months. Add to that the not so rosy situation that it's not going to be May 9th, it's going to be a long time after that the Russian push will continue, and it probably will come to a place where by June or so, or July probably, the Russian pipes start cracking, bursting, and then they are in a, absolute, desperate situation. On top of that, I'll go back to your last time's, prediction that the baby boomer generation retires this year in the United States at the average age of 70. And by 2022 end, you said most people will be in conserving mode, out of spending out of pension than out of earnings. So we're basically going to face a serious situation here sometime in the middle of 2022 onwards. And if the least that could be done was to get the oil thing back to current situation. That itself, you said, technically will take between a year to 2. So you're going to be seeing a very, very bleak situation over the next 2 to 3 years. Your prognosis for the global economy now for the next 12 to 24 months?
The global economy is going to be in recession, maybe even depression. We are at a break point where globalization is collapsing and the demographics of so many countries are turning. We've always known, demographically speaking, that this was going to be the decade where the old economic model of globalization was going to fail. We've always known it's coming. The COVID epidemic sped things up, and Ukraine has put in a hard stop. So we're there. This is the year it's all breaking down. Something to keep in mind. When the Americans created globalization, it was done as a bribe. We were trying to convince countries to join us against the Soviets. So you can participate in any supply chain, participate in manufacturing, access any market, access our market, if in exchange you ally with us against the Soviets. India didn't join. India has been relatively pro-Soviet. In fact, the Indians were pro-Soviet even when the Soviets were gone. What that means is when globalization collapses, India doesn't have to fall all that far because India never invested its economy into the international network. And since you have functional boycotts, not boycotts, not the word, since you have functional control, if you want it, over who gets Persian Gulf energy, India is going to suffer, yes, unavoidable. You may not have invested your entire economy in it, but there's no way that you can break the imports and the export system of the world without feeling something. That goes for the U.S. too. But India is going to hold the control to the gates of the Persian Gulf. And to think that India won't take advantage of that and get some benefits from that, I think is being very, very creative. So we're all going to have to learn to think a little bit differently in this world we're evolving into. But India is one of a half a dozen countries in the world that is actually reasonably well set up, not for the current age, but for what's coming. And every competitor you have is on the other side of that ledger.
Thanks a lot, Peter. That's quite heartening, although, a slightly grim situation for the world at large. With that, thank you, Peter. I will move on to the next session now.
Take care.
Thank you, gentlemen, for that insightful session. Anand, can we please request you to stay on the stage for our next session?
Ankit, I was thinking, and Anand as well, there's pawn promotion for queening. There is, of course, the classic castling, but there's no predictable move for a Russian